Now recognize the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes.
Yield to
Mr.
Mr.
Gates.
Massie.
Thank the gentleman from Florida. You know, I want to talk about two entrepreneurs and ask the witnesses questions about these. The first entrepreneur I want to talk about is Mr. Eric Flannery, who I think the Buckeye Institute has represented. And some might say this is orthogonal to the hearing today, but I think it's on topic because his business, his sole proprietorship, was the target of regulations here in Washington, D.C. that really should have been the purview of Congress if we were following the Constitution. Mr. Alt, can you talk about Eric Flannery's case and how he's been prosecuted?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, the Buckeye Institute represents Eric Flannery, who runs the Big Board here on Capitol Hill, a bar and restaurant. During the pandemic, he was subject to the long shutdown in Washington, D.C., and was able to hold on throughout that, only to see the city ultimately put in place a vaccine verification requirement for all bars operating in D.C. He would literally have to have someone at the front checking vaccine IDs. Mr. Flannery took the position that that was not appropriate for him to do, and so he issued a tweet the day before the regulation went into place saying that everyone was welcome in his bar. For that, the full weight of the D.C. government was brought down upon him. 4 separate agencies engaged in pulling his licenses and closing his business, pursuant to a series of emergency orders that had been issued. And to your question, Congress has the authority to regulate the federal district under Article 1, Section 8, and they've delegated some portion of that authority to the D.C. government in the Home Rule Act of 1973, but they retained authority to themselves with regard to overseeing the government. Any piece of legislation that is passed by the D.C. government has to be subject to review under 30 days. It can be repealed by Congress, with one notable limited exception. The D.C. City Council can issue emergency orders, which can only be in effect for, I believe, 45 days. D.C. government went ahead and stacked these emergency orders for a period of in excess of 2 years, and it was pursuant to this authority that Mr. Flannery was fined and closed and subjected to multiple penalties. And so in our federal lawsuit, we currently are pending before the D.C. Circuit. We have challenged the proper authority to do so and recognize that they have, that D.C. government in fact usurped Congress's authority by denying Congress the ability reasonable oversight as is required by the Constitution.
And this man you're representing is somebody that I've met. He treats his customers like family. He treats his employees as if they were family. And so I reject the notion that was raised earlier that these agencies and these kind of laws and administrative rulings is only used against big companies. And now, shifting my focus to another entrepreneur, I would argue the most successful living entrepreneur in the United States at the moment. I count FTC, SEC, NLRB, FCC, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and FAA among the administrative agencies who've gone after this gentleman for having the temerity to say that he might not vote Democrat, and for having the temerity to say that he was going to buy a social media company to make sure that free speech could be preserved. And also, you know, for having the temerity to bring broadband to rural America after over a decade of government spoon-feeding cronies with the false promise that we would get broadband in rural America. He finally did it. And for that, he's been brought before all of these agencies. Mr. Chenoweth, do you want to talk about any one of those cases and how the administrative agencies have been used to weaponize against a successful entrepreneur?
Well, it's certainly very suspicious the way that all of these agencies, and you might call it a whole of government effort to go after Mr. Musk since his purchase of Twitter. I think it's, you know, I don't think that there's an explanation for all of this happening at the same time that isn't at least a little bit nefarious. In terms of rural broadband, you know, he was, I believe the contract that he got from FCC that was revoked was for under $1 billion. It was 800 and some million dollars, and the replacement that's been proposed is something like $42 billion instead. just to avoid using Mr. Musk's satellites to provide the rural broadband, that doesn't seem like a good use of taxpayer money to me. But from an administrative law standpoint, my concern with what's happening to him is that if, you say maybe the most successful entrepreneur in America, certainly one of the richest and most powerful entrepreneurs in America, if the administrative state can do this to him, just imagine what it can do to Mr. and Mrs. Smith on Main Street in your congressional district. They just don't stand a chance against the full power of the federal government in these administrative agencies without an independent federal judge standing between them and the federal agency.
I thank the gentleman, Mr. Chenoweth, and I want to, my time's expired. I want to submit for the record a dissenting statement of FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr in that case against Starlink. It says in part, today the FCC adds itself to the growing list of administrative agencies that are taking action against Elon Musk's business. I am not the first to notice a pattern here. 2 months ago, the Wall Street Journal editorial board wrote that the volume of government investigations into his business makes us wonder if the Biden administration is targeting him for regulatory harassment. I certainly think so. If you find a turtle on a fence post, it didn't get there by accident. And if you find 8 of them on fence posts, something's going on. And I ask unanimous consent to submit this for the record. Okay, without objection, so ordered. And I now recognize Mr. Van Drew for 5 minutes from New Jersey.